Welcome. Thank you for joining us for another program from the Adams County Historical Society. My name is Antigoni Ladd and I'm a board member here. Tonight I will be your host as well as one of the presenters as we unveil a new research tool available to all members and anyone going online to our website. The Historical Society is unveiling the Great War Veterans Database. And tonight we're going to tell the story of how we did it, how you can use it, and the human interest stories that we found as we built the database. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't remind you that we need your support and your help to continue the work of the Historical Society. We're in process of building a new research facility, a library, a building, a museum, and any donation of any size is much appreciated and will help us to keep all of our artifacts, many of which we access for this database. We keep all of them safe. So with that, I'd like to introduce two members of the Military Research Committee, Valerie Young and Carlos Mutis, and they will tell us what they're going to cover in the program this evening, and then we'll dive right into it. Valerie, why don't I start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit about your part of the program this evening?
Thank you, Antigoni. My part of the program will introduce you to the World War I Veterans Research Project and how it came about. I'll talk about our research approach, the team responsibilities, and the primary and secondary sources of information we used, and provide examples of each of these source materials. I'll describe the three products that resulted from the research work, the database, the electronic folders, and the user's guide, all of which are available on the Historical Society's website.
Thank you. Carlos, I'll turn it over to you to tell us about your part of the program.
Thank you, Antigoni. I will cover what we learned as a result of this project. A couple things I will touch on, for example, the SATC, which was a program in the colleges and universities for college-aged men to help get them ready for active duty in France in the war. We'll look at the CAC, which was a unit here at home for coastal defenses. We'll also look at African-American soldiers in World War I. Look at a little bit at the Stanton family, an African-American family that served during World War I. We'll move forward with some of the brothers, families that sent off 3, 4, or 5 sons to World War I in service. We'll also look at some of the statistics. That's what I'll end with. Some information about where these veterans are buried, both in Adams County as well as throughout the country and even overseas. And that's where I'll end it.
Thank you very much. And so with that, I think we should just dive into the program. So Valerie, you're on first.
Thank you, Antigoni. It's a pleasure to be with you all again. I shared the background of my Adams County connection, the Bauer and Bentzel families from New Oxford, in the presentation I did for ACHS back on August 20th of last year. The presentation was titled The Bauer Brothers, Great War Heroes of Adams County, and is available for viewing on the ACHS YouTube channel, and I encourage you to watch it there to learn more about my background and connection to this project. My introduction to this particular project came in the form of a telephone call from Antigoni on April 11th last year, just as the pandemic was shutting everything down. Antigoni mentioned how much she enjoyed my 2 journal articles and asked if I'd like to be on the Military Research Committee and if I might be interested in helping out with the World War I Veterans Database project. Looking ahead to months of staying put, I said yes to both questions and was very glad I did. It gave me a worthwhile and interesting project to work on through the pandemic months up until this very day. These are the covers of the 2 Historical Society journals that hold my 2 essays. I started writing about my grandfather's story and the stories of the Gold Star soldiers after my first trip to the Meuse-Argonne area of France in the fall of 2016. My travel and research and writing resulted in several essays, 2 of which were published by the Historical Society. The 2018 journal on the left in the pink cover contains the Gold Star Soldiers story. This was an update of the Gold Star Soldiers biographies that were told in the 1921 Eichelberger Foulk book, which I will describe in the next slide, and Antigoni will speak of in her part of the presentation. The 2019 journal on the right contains the story of my journey of discovery of my World War I grandfather, Chester Allen Bower, his history, family, and life. And both of these journals are available through the Historical Society's website. The foundation for the World War I Veterans Research Project is this book, Adams County in the World War, written and published in 1921 by Percy Eichelberger and Paul Foulk. The book was one of several mementos that my mother kept that related to her father's World War I service. I learned from my family genealogy research that Paul Foulk was my great uncle by marriage. He was the husband of my grandfather's youngest sister, Mary Bower. The book provides an account of activities in Adams County that supported the Great War effort. It has a chapter on the 53 Gold Star soldiers of Adams County, those who died in service during the war years, which became the basis for my first article published by the Historical Society. The largest part of the book, however, is a listing by hometown of all the men and women from the county who served during the war. Antigoni will describe later how this book came to be published, how the data was gathered, and share insights we learned about the authors from a speech that Paul Foulk gave to the Adams County Historical Society in November 1941 to commemorate the 20-year mark since the book had been published. The document on the right is an original order form for the book, which sold for $4 in 1921. I like one sentence in particular, why the authors think you should buy this book. With this book in your possession, you will be able to follow the war activities of any individual or organization from Adams County that assisted in winning the war. Using the book as our foundation, we developed an overall framework for how to organize the research and our products. During the first several months of research, we decided that the project should consist not only of the spreadsheet itself, where all of the data is entered, but also of electronic copies of the documents we found that supported the data. And after working several more months, we decided that a user's guide to the project would also be important for anyone accessing the documents online. So the project consists of these three components, represented by the icons in this slide: the database in the form of a spreadsheet, individual electronic folders with documents, and the user's guide. Another key part of the project's framework was how we went about sharing this big work effort. One of the reasons and key attractions to my getting involved in the project was the fact that Antigoni had already created the first spreadsheet, using the book as the starting point and identifying the main data categories to include. This was a Herculean effort, as you can imagine, as there are over 1,100 names in the book. Since she had been the creator of the spreadsheet, we decided early on that she would continue to be the keeper of this component of the project. Since I had already created electronic document folders for all of the Gold Star soldiers for that research, we decided that I would be the keeper of the project's electronic documents. Carlos then joined the team about midway through the project and offered to proof our work and conduct additional research. And it was so great to have his extra set of eyes. We split the spreadsheet in half, then swapped sections to review and add to each other's work. We made some important early decisions about how we would approach the project as well. We decided that our work was not going to be at the same level of detail as the Gold Star Soldiers research that I had developed for my article. That would be way too time-consuming, and it really wasn't the purpose of our work. What we wanted was to create an easy-to-use database with key pieces of information that could serve as a starting point for users to begin their own research. We wanted to have the same information to the extent possible for each person, information that would provide the basics of a veteran's life and military service. So now I'll describe each of the components, starting with the database itself. The very first activity, which I mentioned that Antigoni mostly did, was to populate the spreadsheet with information from the World War I book. We decided that it would be appropriate and good research practice to try to corroborate all of the data entries with at least 3 additional sources of information, and that these sources should be free, easily accessible, and provide the majority of data we needed. The next slide will discuss these sources. And where we couldn't find information in the first tier of sources, Antigoni agreed to use her pay-for-use accounts to supplement them. More on that in the next slide. We identified our sources with acronyms and a numbering system, providing a legend at the end of the spreadsheet. We kept track of book errors, of which there were some, and our corrections to them, and unique and unfound information and other items of interest in the notes column. I would really encourage you to look at the notes column because a lot of good information is kept there. A key approach to the work was not to be satisfied with the word unfound, which is the word we put into a cell in the spreadsheet if we couldn't find a piece of data. We decided that we would keep looking and keep sharing information and sharing the spreadsheet until we found something. So these are our sources of information for the project. The primary sources, which I indicated are free and easily accessible, were the U.S. Veterans Administration Master Index Card, the World War I Draft Registration Form, and Find a Grave. All of these items can be accessed through the Family Search website. Family Search is a genealogy website provided by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. It's free of charge to anyone, anywhere, but you do set up a user's account. And Find a Grave is its own website that you do not need to access through Family Search, but Family Search provides you with links to it, which makes it really easy to use. The additional sources that Antigoni provided were Ancestry.com for additional military records, family trees, and other miscellaneous items. She also used newspapers.com for obituaries and other news articles about the veterans and their families. And she also used Fold3, which just has military records and is a subsidiary of Ancestry.com. Now I'd like to provide some background on each of the 3 primary sources and share examples of them so you can see how we gleaned and corroborated the spreadsheet data. First up is the Veterans Administration Master Index Card. This example happens to be for my grandfather, Chester Bauer, and this collection contains images of index cards for veterans who served at any time during World War I and who made or whose heirs made pension or benefits claims of the VA between 1917 and 1940. Each card contains the name of the veteran, as well as other personal identifying information, such as home address, date of birth, date of death, and military service information, such as rank, branch of service, a service number, date of entry into the service, and date of discharge, and there are claim codes along the side. If there were more claims than could fit on the front of the card, they were entered on the back of the card, which is on the right. So I'll quickly describe Chester's card and how you can see we were able to pull this information and enter it into our spreadsheet. His name is there, Chester Allen Bauer. His unit that he served with, he was a private with Company G, the 315th Infantry. It shows his hometown of New Oxford, PA. His service number, his date of death, December 30th, 1939. His date of birth, August 30th, 1894. The date he entered service, which was September 21st, 1917. And his date of discharge, which was June 7th, 1919. And you do see along the side there that he made several claims through the VA system. I'm showing you the second card because this is a card that we found some of that has no military service information whatsoever other than the service number. We don't know why this is, but for whatever reason, all that's on this card is the person's name, Myron Henry Knaus from Arntsville, his service number, his date of birth, and his date of death, and the few claims that he filed. We were able to glean some information from this card, however, so this becomes a good corroborating resource for us. I won't go into the claim codes here, but if anybody would like information about them, I can provide that via email through the Historical Society. Next, we'll talk about the World War I draft registration card. This collection consists of images of draft registration cards for World War I. There were 3 draft registrations between 1917 and 1918. The first was held on June 5th, 1917, for men between the ages of 21 and 31. The second draft was held a year later on June 5th, 1918, for men who had turned 21 since the first registration. And the third draft was held on September 12th, 1918, for men between the ages of 18 and 45. We have cards in our collection from all 3 drafts, but the majority are from the June 1917 registration date. The information included for each registration differs somewhat on the cards, but the basic general information that was collected, and that is shown here, includes some order and serial numbers up at the top in handwriting that were assigned by the Selective Service System, a full name, date and place of birth, race, citizenship, occupation and employment information, a personal description, and a signature. The card also asks if they were supporting any dependents, had had previous military service, and if they could claim an exemption from the draft, which some tried to do. There are approximately 24 million cards of men and a few women who registered for the draft. This represented about 23% of the total population of the United States in 1918. It is important to note that not all of the men who registered for the draft actually served in the military, and not all of the men who served in the military registered for the draft. Men who were already in service, for example, typically would not have a draft card, and men who enlisted prior to the draft also might not have a draft card. These are just 2 of the reasons why there wouldn't be a draft card in the folder that you are looking in. Also, these are not military service records. They ended when the person reported to the Army training camp and different methods of service reports were developed. So we'll look at 2 examples of these to help you see what is on them and why we selected them as one of our primary data sources. The first card is for John Levi Stock, and the Stock families were longtime Adams County residents. And in fact, my grandmother, Goldie Bauer of New Oxford, lived in a home that was owned by a Stock family after her husband, my grandfather, died. Mr. Stock is from New Oxford. His birthday is in February of 1894. He's a natural-born citizen. And the sections that I find really interesting and that I hope someone someday will pick up and do some research and compilation on is his occupation and who he's employed by, because I think these are really great windows into what was happening in New Oxford and Adams County and the rest of the country at the time, and really provides a good sense of what was happening socially and culturally with regard to employment. So Mr. Stock was a principal of the high school and grade school. He was employed by the New Oxford School Board. So someone who was well-known and important in that community. Another interesting feature of this is on the right-hand part of the card, the back side, you'll note the name of the registrar, who's Uriah Stock. Were Uriah and John Stock related? We don't know. And perhaps that's an avenue of research for someone to find out if these 2 men knew each other with the same last name when Mr. John Stock came in to file his draft registration form. This card is for an African-American man who is from Gettysburg, Freeman Levi Stanton. Carlos will talk a little bit more about him in his part of the presentation. We use the term colored in our spreadsheet because it was common use at the time of the Great War. You will see that the information categories are the same on this card as the previous one. Mr. Stanton lived at 132 West Street in Gettysburg. He was born in March of 1896, a natural-born citizen. He worked as a laborer, and in section 9, you can see that he supported his mother. Said his race was Negro, and gave his physical description in the back of the card section on the right-hand side. There is one distinction between this card and the one for Mr. Stock, and I'll toggle between them here so you can see if you can catch it. Again, this is Mr. Stock's card, and this is Mr. Stanton's card. You will note that the lower corners of Mr. Stanton's card are cut off at a diagonal, and those for Mr. Stock are not. There's a small bit of writing on Mr. Stock's card that will tell you why this is the case. If person is of African descent, tear off this corner. So this was a small difference in the design of these cards that provided a visual and physical cue to the draft boards and military personnel of the person's race without having to read through all of the information in the card. We'll now turn to Find a Grave website. And as I mentioned, the Family Search website will give you information from Find a Grave and provide a link to the website for the actual information that is contained there. This is the type of information you can find: burial location, including the name and address of the cemetery, and plot information, birth and death dates, family member information, if you're lucky, and grave marker photographs. Some Find a Grave entries are chock full of information, and some are quite lacking. The Find a Grave entries are populated by individual volunteer contributors, and it became a wholly owned subsidiary of Ancestry.com in 2013. But by and large, if someone was buried in the United States, you can typically find them in the Find a Grave system. I wanted to show you several different examples of grave markers for our veterans so you can see how information is displayed and why we selected this as one of our primary sources. On this slide are 3 examples of grave markers that do not contain military service information. So we're not going to get military corroboration data from these types of grave markers. On the one on the left, for Mr. Leo Wagaman, we have actual dates of birth and death, which is great. We have month, date, and year, not only for him, but also for his wife. And on the 2 on the right, we just have years of death and birth, not the actual dates, and no other information. So while we can't use these for military corroboration data, we can use them for a host of other pieces of information that we were looking for. In our research, we found many instances of differing dates of birth and death for the veterans. In most cases, if we had a grave marker photo and Find a Grave information, we used that as our set of dates. We figured when your dates are being carved into your grave marker, that's a pretty good indication of the data being correct. However, we did find instances where grave marker information was not correct, and the spreadsheet notes column identifies where we have that kind of inconsistent information. These are examples of grave markers that do contain military information, and you can see that there is a wide variety of types of markers and how the information is shown. In the top left and center is a standard military white marble grave marker from an American military cemetery. Mr. Sterner is buried at Gettysburg National Cemetery, and as is sometimes found, his wife is buried with him, and her information is on the reverse side of the marker. So when you go to visit a national military cemetery, this is typically the type of stone that you will see for veterans who are buried there. There are 2 more military marker examples for Mr. Melvin Byers in the upper right corner, and then for Mr. Ralph Tagg in the lower left corner. And Mr. Tagg is someone who's in my family tree. And Mr. Byers is a stone marker, and Mr. Tagg's is a bronze marker. But you will see that all of these military style markers, which are offered to veterans from the US military, have all pretty standard information. We have the full name, the state through which the veteran entered service, a listing of their service information, which unit they served with, the war that they served in, and then their dates of birth and death. So lots of really good information from these markers. There are 2 other markers here that I wanted to show you that are also useful in terms of military information. The one in the center in the bottom row is for Mr. William H. Armour, born 1896, died 1979. So while there's no military information on his grave marker at all, you will see the circular bronze marker just below Mr. Armour's gravestone. This is a standard U.S. military issued marker. It's made of bronze, and they are made specifically for the war that you served in. And you will typically find these at civilian cemeteries for veterans who might not have military information on their marker, or they might, but they typically accompany a gravestone in a civilian cemetery where we know that the person buried there was a veteran. And in the lower right, you'll see a headstone for a Mr. August Powell and his wife Beulah. And at first blush, it looks like this doesn't have much military information on it. But if you can see it on the slide, in between Mr. Powell's name and his wife's name, there's a small inscription that says 305th Battalion Tank Corps. So Mr. Powell clearly thought it was important to share his World War I service information in a small kind of a way. And this is really great because we can use that then to corroborate his military service information that we may get from other sources. We did want to show you a sample database page, which is what is on the screen now, just so you have a sense of what it looks like if you decide to go to the website and take a look at it. The names are alphabetical in the rows going down, and the columns across the top have the individual data types. So we have last name, first name, middle name, hometown or residence, the war they served in, the cemetery where they're buried, their date of birth, their date of death, the branch of military service, and then reference 1 refers to the Eichelberger and Foulk book, the World War I book, and that number is the page number in the book where this particular veteran is described. Reference 2, we created this column for other Adams County Historical Society resources that we might find. As of now, the only resource that's in that column is the Gold Star Soldiers article. That's the GSSUC. But we hope over time, if we find more resources from the Historical Society holdings, then we would be able to add them into the spreadsheet. The other references is where we categorize Find a Grave, Family Search, Ancestry with acronyms. And then we have our useful notes column. And then on the final column, we have the documents that are in the file. And this is a numbering system for what you can find in terms of electronic documents. And the acronyms and the numbering system are defined by legend at the end of the spreadsheet. So the electronic folders component of the project occurs on the website in groupings. It's alphabetical by last name with first and middle name included. The documents included in the folders are those that are identified by code in the spreadsheet. And you'll see if you go from folder to folder that we have a consistent file naming convention for the documents that you find. Typically starts with the last name of the veteran and then a naming convention for the type of document that it is. Again, we focused on finding documents from the 3 primary sources and supplemented with others along the way. There are more documents in the Gold Star Soldiers folders. Most of the documents that I used to research and write that essay have been transferred into the folders for this project. We really didn't want all that work to go to waste. So if you're looking at the Gold Star Soldiers folders, you will certainly find that there are more documents there than there are for all of the other soldiers that were not Gold Star soldiers. And we found this piece of information really interesting, that there were only 11 names for which we could find no information. And with a total of 1,113 names, this represents just less than 1% of the veterans that we still need to find. Perhaps someone might be interested in picking up the mantle and trying to find information about them. And for those that we did not have any documents, we did not create a folder for them yet. Finally, a few notes about the user's guide. It is intended to be used with the database and the electric folders. It identifies the sources that we used and what is included in each of the columns, and little notes about why you see what you see in certain spaces of the spreadsheet. It also provides definitions of acronyms and the codes that we used, and it duplicates the legend from the end of the spreadsheet. The spreadsheet and the user's guide are available to download from the Society's website. You can have those handy when you access the folders. And the great thing is you can also download the files within the electronic folders if you want. Those are downloadable. Antigoni will have a slide at the end showing where you can access the project files on the ACHS website. And with that, I will turn the presentation back over to you.
Thank you, Valerie, for that excellent presentation. And I do have to thank you personally for the many, many, many hours you put in keeping us honest and keeping the data verified. There were many times when I gave up and took the shortcut and said, that's just it on a particular research piece. And you said, let's check one more source. And by gum, you were always right. So thank you for keeping us honest. Now I want to ask a question of both of you that has come up. I keep bragging about the stories. I say there are stories that we've discovered. Have you and Carlos written up any stories that are published anywhere? Are they in the database, or is the database literally the spreadsheet and then those files of documents that we have on them?
So no, the answer to that is no, we haven't written any more stories. The stories that have been written are those of the Gold Star soldiers, and those are in my journal essay from a couple of years ago. All of the Gold Star soldiers do have small biography stories written about them in that journal essay. But we haven't written any new stories with what we have found through the data. But in working with all of this information that we've developed and looking at all of the different resource materials, the documents, as we've showed you, we do know that stories about individuals, about groups of individuals, about families, about service do exist. And these are the things that we're sharing with you tonight, just from our familiarity with what we have discovered. But the task remains to actually get into the spreadsheet and parse your own stories out of our information that we've gathered. And we really do hope that people in the future, users and researchers and people that are interested in, might begin to write more stories about these World War I veterans that now can be based on real information, real data that we have put together for you.
Thank you. Carlos, what's your experience?
Yeah, thank you, Antigoni. And from my research, having used, for example, Ancestry.com, it's a wonderful resource because, of course, there are obituaries and death certificates, draft registration cards, and family trees. I was making connections with a lot of these veterans through other people's family trees on Ancestry. And it shows the bigger picture of who, where they came from, who their parents were, grandparents, and so on and so forth. So no, there are no stories that we've written ourselves, but doing the research, you start to understand these people, these individuals, who they were, how they lived their lives. Sometimes some good information about where they were when they passed away, even possibly how or what caused their death. And there's even a section in Ancestry that for stories. So if you were a relative of one of these individuals or wanted to take the time to write a story and put all these pieces together, it's like a puzzle, and you create their story, maybe a short narrative of this person's life and service and even their death. That's been my experience. And even though we haven't written those stories, you do get to know these individuals on a much more intimate, personal level because of the research that we've done.
Thank you. And I will share one little story from my own experience. A friend of mine asked me, she found her grandfather was in this list. And she said, what do you know about him? And I pulled up his draft registration card and I showed it to her. And she looked at it and she said, well, I never knew him. But I turned to page 2 of the draft registration card where it listed his height, his weight, color of his eyes, color of his hair. And she suddenly started crying. She said, he must have looked like me He was the same height I am, the same color hair, the same color eyes. She said, I never met him and I have no pictures of him. Thank you for giving me this information. So the story is in the data. We just have to apply it. Okay, so thank you both very, very much. Why don't we go on? Carlos, you have the interesting stories to share that we did put together from the data. I'll turn it over to you for your part of the program. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carlos Mutis. I'm from Tehachapi, California, and I get to cover what we learned. Here's a quick introduction. It's me at Devil's Den in Gettysburg, one of my absolute favorite places to visit. Just a bit about me. I'm an adult basic education teacher. I work with incarcerated men at one of our prisons here in California. And I teach history, math, social studies, science, and reading language, very important. All levels, remedial to advanced, which also means I cover elementary to high school grades. And I do my part to help these men earn their GED or high school diplomas, thereby hopefully reducing our recidivism, because they need these diplomas or GED to get into vocational programs, college, or to get employment. I'm also an adjunct professor of history with Cerro Coastal Community College, a rural community college in the Eastern Sierras in Central California. And there you can see I've taught history of Mexico, history of the U.S., and history of Western civilization for them. Now we're going to start with two units that were around during World War I but are no longer in existence. For example, the Student Army Training Corps, or the SATC. Now this was created during World War I, and it was done so because the War Department concluded that there was a drastic need for trained soldiers. One of the solutions was the SATC. This was created to encourage young men to volunteer to receive both a college education and train for the military simultaneously. Training camps were held in the summer of 1918 to prepare institutions for the induction of the SATC for the upcoming fall semester. The SATC officially began on October 1st, 1918. It was located on the campuses of 525 educational institutions and inducted approximately 200,000 students on the first day. Unlike the selective service draft, enrollment in the SATC was completely voluntary. However, doing so gave you the rank of private in the United States Army. Therefore, it was not a way of avoiding enlistment. While attending the SATC did allow for young men to stay on the home front, the ultimate goal of the SATC was to create trained soldiers for the war. Despite the planning and efforts, the SATC lasted only 6 weeks, as the armistice that led to the eventual end of the war was signed on November 11, 1918, thereby ending the Army's need for more soldiers. The SATC was disbanded in December of 1918, and we have counted a total of 62 young men who participated from Adams County in the SATC. Next, I'd like to discuss the Coast Artillery Corps, or the CAC. Now, unlike the SATC, the CAC was around before World War I and even through World War II and a little bit after. The CAC was created in 1901 and would be disbanded in 1950. Now, the CAC was responsible for coastal, harbor, and anti-aircraft defenses of the United States between 1901 and 1950. Now, the rapid technological development during and immediately after World War II made such coastal defenses obsolete. In total, we would have 5 men serving in the CAC during World War I from Adams County. Next, we will look at African American troops. During World War I, units were segregated. As a result, African American soldiers were assigned to only 2 divisions. The 92nd Infantry Division, also known as the Buffalo Soldiers, and the 93rd Infantry Division, also known as the Blue Helmets. Additionally, those that saw action in France fought with French troops, not American troops. African Americans have been involved in America's conflicts since colonial times, going back to the French and Indian Wars. They have an illustrious history of service and, in many cases, generations of one family who served and sacrificed despite not being afforded the same rights or even freedoms as others. One of these generational families is the Stanton family of Gettysburg. Here we see Freeman Levi Stanton on the left and his brother Jacob Arthur Stanton on the right. Both brothers served in the 92nd Infantry Division, with Freeman serving in the 368th Infantry Regiment and Jacob serving in the 350th Artillery Regiment. Freeman is buried at Lincoln Cemetery in Gettysburg. His brother Jacob is buried at Gettysburg National Cemetery. Freeman and Jacob had an older brother named Samuel Matthew Stanton, Jr. Samuel's service began well before World War I in 1899 when he enlisted in the U.S. Army. He would go on to serve in the U.S. Navy as well. All told, he would serve for 32 years and served during the Spanish-American War and World War I. Their father, Samuel Matthew Stanton Sr., and their uncle, Samuel Sr.'s brother, Greenberry, both served during the American Civil War in colored infantry regiments. Greenberry continued in active duty after the Civil War. By our count, there were 16 African American men in service from Adams County during the Great War. The first 7 recruits were given a hearty send-off by the community, and it was reported in the Gettysburg Times in October 1917. We have printed the full newspaper story in the Historical Society's blog page, but here's the lead sentence to give you a flavor of that article. Quote, "Nothing but smiles, good wishes, and a hearty and cheerful goodbye was seen at the Western Maryland Station this morning when 7 colored boys of Gettysburg left for Camp Meade to do their share in their country's hour of need. The scene at the station was in striking contrast to those which were witnessed when both of the white contingents left within the past few weeks." End quote. The story goes on to report the food boxes prepared for each soldier, the large send-off crowd, and the reminders to, quote, "write to your mother," end quote, shouted at the men as they boarded the train. More than one family sent brothers off to military service. In addition to the Stanton brothers, there were the Lyles brothers, Reuben and William Henry, the Lane brothers, John and Robert, and the Williams brothers, John and Joseph. All of these men but one would return safely from service. Sadly, Joseph Albert Williams was killed by German artillery fire during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918. He was only 25 years old, and he is buried in the Meuse-Argonne American Cemetery in France. Here is his gravesite in France. Several of these World War I veterans are buried in the Lincoln Cemetery in Gettysburg, which is located in the southwestern part of town. The historic cemetery was established in 1867 following the Civil War, when African American veterans were denied burial in the National Cemetery.
Now, this is one of my absolute favorite images from my research. It's a memorial with the names of the 30 African American soldiers that were denied burial at the National Cemetery and were instead buried here. You can see their names with the unit identification. And what a great quote. Without benefit of citizenship, they fought for freedom. Absolutely true.
Today, the cemetery is the final resting place for not only veterans, but many prominent civilians from Gettysburg. A database of the 440 individuals buried in Lincoln Cemetery is available online at the Adams County Historical Society. And if you want to learn more about the cemetery's rich history, you should read the book, Segregation and Death, Gettysburg's Lincoln Cemetery by Betty Dorsey Myers. Next, we will look at brothers from Gettysburg who served together. We will start with the Dubbs brothers of Gettysburg, who are pictured here, and they are Allen Armour, Jacob Winfield, and William Henry. Also, the Bixler brothers of McSherrystown. In total, 5 brothers would serve in World War I, and by our count, this is the most of any Adams County family. There are Charles Edwin, Gerald Clarence, Henry Joseph, Ellis Jules, and Raymond Joseph. Sadly, Ellis Jules would be killed by an explosion on board the USS Sac City on February 7, 1930, near Rotterdam, Netherlands. He was only 29. We also have the Stewart brothers of Gettysburg, Donald Mclean and Horace Myers. Their father was Dr. Henry Stewart, well-known physician and inventor in Gettysburg. He was also president of the Adams County Historical Society for many years. Dr. Stewart's mother, and Donald and Horace's grandmother, was Salome Myers Stewart, who would serve as a nurse at St. Francis Xavier Catholic Church during the Battle of Gettysburg. Her diary would go on to be published under the title The Ties of the Past, The Gettysburg Diaries of Salome Myers Stewart, 1854 to 1922. We also have the Sandeau brothers of Biglerville, Ralph Thornton, Luther Elridge, Edgar Coe, and George David. By my count, 93 sets of brothers served during World War I from Adams County. The Bower brothers of New Oxford. You can learn more about their service in an article titled Brothers in Service, written by Valerie J. Young, a member on this very committee, for the World War I Centennial newsletter. There is also a presentation she made back in August of 2020 for Adams County Historical Society titled The Bower Brothers, and it can be found on the Society's YouTube channel. Chester Allen. He was a private in the 79th Division. His unit served in the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, where he was gassed close to the armistice. He suffered from chronic health issues in the 20 years he lived after returning home. He died in 1939 at the age of 45. His brother Charles Edward was a sergeant in the U.S. Army Medical Corps. He died of the influenza pandemic while at Camp Mills, Long Island, New York. He was just 20 and a half years old. The Gold Star Soldiers of Adams County are an important part of the database project. The practice of families displaying a flag with a gold star to signify that a soldier had died in service came into use during World War I. This practice is still in use today. There were 53 soldiers from Adams County who died during World War I service. They are commemorated on a bronze plaque at the Adams County Courthouse, shown in this slide. Of the 53 men, 16 died stateside while preparing for foreign duty, and 37 died overseas. Of those who died overseas, 12 are buried permanently in American military cemeteries in France, and the sailor who died at sea is memorialized at a military cemetery in England. The remainder were returned to the U.S. after the war, and most of them were buried in Adams County. 28 of these soldiers were either killed in action or died from wounds received in action. The others died of the influenza pandemic or accidents in service. The Gold Star soldiers' stories are told in both the Eichelberger Foulk book and in Valerie's article published in the Adams County Historical Journal of 2018. And, as Valerie mentioned earlier, their electronic file folders contain most of the documents she found in conducting her research on them.
Some more of the stuff that we learned regarding the branches of service, you can see Adams County citizens' residents and which branches they served in. You can see a total of 878 by far in the Army. Student Army Training Corps, which I covered earlier. Nursing, you had 14 members. The Marine Corps, 13. And right on down to the Merchant Marines, who had one member of one resident of Adams County serving in the Merchant Marines. Now here are the cemeteries that many of these men and women are buried in. You can see the local cemetery, Evergreen, having by far the most interments, followed by Gettysburg National Cemetery, and then some of the surrounding cemeteries, including all the way in Arlington, Virginia, at Arlington National Cemetery. And a total of 36 veterans that we could not find burial information. But hopefully someday we will have that opportunity. And with my final slide, I will talk about veterans that are buried outside of Pennsylvania, but are from Adams County. As you can see, we have West Point Military Academy in New York. Of course, I already mentioned Arlington. We have members who are residents who are buried in Pensacola, California, Hawaii, Illinois. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you for your time.
The artwork we selected for this program shows a puzzle. Well, for much of our 2-year-long project, our team members felt like we were working on a puzzle. I cannot tell you how many times we had emails and phone calls back and forth trying to verify something like a date or a burial site for a veteran where there was too little information, or sometimes finding the opposite, too many people with the same name. But we have now finished our project. It's going to be up to those of you in the audience and future researchers who can contribute new stories, new dates, new photographs, new documents. We welcome you helping to finish this project. What we did learn as we read through the material was we became more and more committed to the project. This was not something that was just statistics. Every time I opened the Eichelberger and Foulk book, I saw another story staring out at me, and I recommitted myself to digging in one more time until I could search out a figure, a date, a location. Let me share one story. There was a veteran whose burial details we couldn't verify. We had searched newspaper obituaries, we looked at genealogy websites, cemetery listings. So one day I decided to give the newspapers one more search, and this time I found him. I didn't look for obituaries, I just looked up any news story that might include the veteran's name, and I found him. A few weeks after returning, he died from the Spanish flu, and so did his brother, and 2 weeks later, so did his mother. No wonder I couldn't find his obituary. Who had the time caring for 3 family members who ultimately succumbed to the flu and then burying them one after the other after the other? Who had time to write up the story to go into the newspaper? So our project, which began as a database, has become more than statistics to us. It's a treasure trove of stories. I'd like to wrap up this program with perhaps the most interesting story of all, the 1921 publication of the book by Foulk and Eichelberger, the book that started us on the project. I'd like to wrap up this program with photos of the veterans, thanks to the Historical Society's collection, and with quotes from Paul Foulk and Percy Eichelberger. Let's start not in World War I, but 20 years later. Deep in the archives of the Adams County Historical Society is this typewritten speech by the Reverend Paul Foulk. It was delivered to the Society in 1941. He had been invited to address the Society on the eve of Armistice Day, 1941. Look at the date in the corner of the letter, and you might just get goosebumps thinking about what was coming. Just a month later, December 7, 1941, the U.S. would become involved once again in a world war. Foulk's speech gives tribute to the veterans of World War I and describes the creation of the book, Adams County in the World War. Well, let's see what is so moving about this book. He begins this speech by saying, "We go back across 23 years to the first Armistice Day, November 11th, 1918. It seems such a short time since the noise of battle ceased, and bedlam of joy broke out. No one can ever forget the celebration of that first glad Armistice Day." Yes, there was surely celebration on the front lines because the fighting had continued all the way to the early days of November. Here's a story from early November, just before the armistice was signed. I'd like to read from the book Gettysburg's Other Battle by local author Mark Snell. He writes, "Charles Schuyler of Ortana, a hamlet in the apple orchards of western Adams County, was mortally wounded. After lingering for 4 days, he succumbed on November the 4th. He had been the only man from his little village to make it to France. Within a week, the armistice between Imperial Germany and the Allies would be signed. Knowing this, and in spite of it, General Pershing relentlessly pressed the attack, and men on both sides were killed needlessly." If you'd like to learn more about this Gold Star soldier, Charles Schuyler, you can check his online file in our database, where we have more than 24 documents. And here is Gettysburg with its citizens gathering on the square on that wonderful day, 11/11/1918, when they heard the news of the war's end. And here are the two authors of the book with the story of why they started the project. He writes in the speech, now this is Paul Foulk looking back, he said 2 Adams County youths who had served in the Army, one was wounded on the Western Front, the other in the Navy, returned to Gettysburg College to complete their college education. Talking over our experience, we both came to this one decision, namely that Adams County had played a noble part in the war. We knew Adams County people were proud of their efforts and great accomplishments during the war period. This quote, again, is from Foulk's speech to the Historical Society. This photo shows a Signal Corps group a year after the armistice, back home and demonstrating the tools of their war experience. They may have left home as farmers or tradesmen, but they returned home experienced soldiers. And here is the book, which Foulk and Eichelberger somehow compiled and edited in a year while still being in college. He said, for the sake of posterity, we wanted to preserve a record of their noble deeds. Our ambitions gradually formed, and we completed plans for a history of the county and its part in the war. This quote says it all about the goals of the authors. We wanted to have a record of every serviceman in the county. What an ambition. Now this story I find amazing. He says they prepared questionnaires mailed to every serviceman. To get the list of servicemen, they had to go to each town where they found partial lists, none of them complete. Day after day, I spent in every section of the county gathering names of servicemen. My co-editor did most of the editing work, while I scoured the county for the information we wanted. Here is what they collected for the book. Each questionnaire, they asked the person's name, his parents' names, the address of where he lived when he entered the service, camps where he trained, different military ranks. They wanted the ships' names. They wanted the ports they left from and where they arrived. They wanted the engagements that the soldiers were in. They wanted to know how they returned and when they returned. I love the quote at the bottom. It was a large order, but we were young, bold, and unafraid. So let me quickly go through the timeline of all this work. The war would end in 1918. It would take until 1919 for the military to bring the soldiers back home. Adams County decided to hold a mass celebration for the veterans, and they selected September 1 for a welcome home day. We'll show you pictures and cover the activities of that day. In 1920, Eichelberger and Foulk had enrolled as college students again. They would be in different classes, but they knew each other. They were both veterans. They were cousins, and they came up with the idea of collecting stories of all the veterans. A year later, they have not only mailed the surveys, but they have edited and published the book, Adams County in the World War. 20 years later, Paul Foulk, in his speech to the Historical Society, describes the book as a tribute to the World War I veterans. In 2019, a committee from the Historical Society decided to tackle building a research base of World War I veterans. Since we had a copy of the book and it spelled out the names of the veterans, all we'd have to do would be add a little statistical work to it, and we'd have a nice research tool for future researchers. 2 years later, we finally got around to finishing the project, and this is working with 3 people on the project. But if you look at it, it is 100 years since the book was published that we finished the stories that they collected. This photo, which we found at the Historical Society, is a photo about 3 feet long that includes 500 of the 1,000 veterans we studied 500 of them who came back on September the 1st, 1919 for Welcome Home Day in Gettysburg. They had a full day of programs, activities, baseball games, meals, dances, but they stopped in the middle of the day to take a group photo, and I am so eternally grateful that they have it. I've clipped pieces of the picture to show you up close, and then we'll show you what the whole photo looks like. Here's what Paul Foulk said in his speech about that day. He said, "Many of us had the pleasure of taking part in the homecoming day on September 1, when a great demonstration of joy was staged in Gettysburg for soldiers, sailors, and nurses who had come back from the conflict. What a fine banquet," he goes on to say, "was served on the athletic field of the Gettysburg High School to the south of Baltimore Street. How wonderfully we were entertained by the Adams County people in Gettysburg. Here is the parade, Welcome Home Day. You see the ambulances going through the center of town. You see the cavalry riding through the center of town. And here are the men themselves marching in order." And here's the newspaper from the next day. "Throngs applaud war veterans. Street parade most stupendous in Adams County history, over 1 mile in length." Second story, "Men well fed by the Red Cross." Third story, "Congressman Moore makes excellent address before huge crowd, extols the county men in the war." And "Victory Dance, a fitting climax. Gobs, doughboys, and officers join in closing event of the day." There were baseball games as well. But my favorite part is the photograph. Here is the center section of the photograph. The newspaper reported that when the photographer asked the 4 nurses who were present to come to the center of the group to be seated under the flag, the men cheered heartily, thanking them for their great service. These are 4 of the 14 nurses from Adams County who were present that day. If you haven't heard the talk by Jane Malone on the World War I nurses, and if you are interested, it is available on YouTube. And here is the photo. These are 500 out of the 1,074 veterans listed in the book who are part of our project. Seeing them here in uniform makes you feel a sense of pride in saving their stories for future generations. Now, I know you can't see this picture very well, so I have a slow pan of the picture, but it is definitely worth seeing in person. See the sailors in the front, the citizens in the back, the nurses in the center, and of course the spectacular cars pulled right up on the field. What a treasure. I think we can sum up our feelings about this project, not in our words, but in the words of the authors, talking about the veterans themselves. They have aided in making history, and the history of the past is the educator of the present and director of the future. Thank you to you 2 gentlemen. So this is our project. It is online and waiting for you to look into those stories. The Foulk and Eichelberger book is also there in PDF form. It's filed under document files. If you want to read through it, it's available. It is fascinating. I guarantee you'll get hooked. And let me close with a couple more stories. Charles Henry Allen, born 1871, is the oldest. Professional soldier originally from Great Britain, served in the British Army and the U.S. in World War I. Baron Holtz from New Oxford, career Army. The youngest, we had several people born in 1902 from Biglerville, McSherrystown, and Gettysburg. The last surviving veteran, Charles Taylor, died in 2002. Just two of the men who had careers in the military, Curtis Kime served in 4 wars. He was a Marine. And Joseph T. Morris would become first base commander of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There are more stories waiting to be discovered as well. Just a few weeks ago, one of our volunteers opened a box of Red Cross documents from World War I, and it contained a logbook listing all the donations from Adams County citizens to be sent to soldiers in European hospitals. A local organizer, Francis Mclean, had set up the Kate Wolf Fund, named for the nurse whose letters home from France were being printed in the local newspaper. In that same box were postcards from France. We're still discovering stories in our archives. On behalf of our team, we ask your support for keeping these stories alive. Please help us save the artifacts in the Historical Society's collection. The non-fireproof building holding these photos, these letters, and books is not a safe place for these precious materials. Your donation will help us build a new research facility and a museum where you can come to see these photos for yourself. Thank you for any contribution you can make to this important project. And thank you for letting us share our passion for this World War I research project.